Before I get into the sermon today, I do just want to say, I was a little bit at a loss of words up here, but the support of this congregation, which is now my new church home, has been really, really palpable to me in this process, and it certainly was last week while we were there, and certainly Patricia and Steve and Roxanne were representatives, but I really felt you guys, and it was such a nice bridge. And another thing is I was talking to the kids, and I really am just so proud of our denomination and who we are. And, I mean, that's an amazing history, that in 1785 we were ordaining an African-American minister, and then in 1850-something a woman, and in 1972 William Johnson as the first openly gay minister. It's something to be proud of. And during seminary, when I was at Union, every year I would receive a handwritten note from William Johnson, who was the first openly gay minister ordained. And I was fortunate and honored enough to have been the recipient of a scholarship in his name that the national denomination gives out. But he made a real point of connecting with me. And so it was really nice to wear this rainbow stole that you all gave me and to feel this mantle being passed. It's an honor. So please pray with me. God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. You are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Epiphany. Epiphany. What does the word epiphany mean to you? Just think for a moment about the word and your own relationship with this word, and what does it mean? Perhaps it's mostly a literary term, as in, she had an epiphany. Or maybe it calls to mind scores from Sweeney Todd, or the music of Chrisette Michel, or the many, many poems that bear the name Epiphany. Or maybe it actually brings to your mind this day, roughly the 12th day after Christmas, when we celebrate the wise guys finding the stable and following the star. I have to say that I'm still trying to figure out exactly what Epiphany means to me. See, growing up evangelical in an evangelical church and an evangelical culture in the South, Epiphany wasn't a thing. It just sort of wasn't. I had no connection of this word with the church. In fact, I remember sort of first stumbling across the word epiphany in elementary school during some sort of reading that we were doing out loud in class. And there was, again, in the literary sense, someone had an epiphany. And I remember raising my hand and saying, what does that word mean? It's a big new vocabulary word. What does it mean? And my teacher, this speaks to the power of a teacher, said, you know how when you read the comic strips, people have bubbles above their head? And sometimes in those bubbles, instead of them talking, they have those other smaller bubbles, and you know that they're thinking a thought. And sometimes you can read and see what they're thinking, and sometimes it's blank because their mind is blank, but sometimes there's a light bulb that goes off over their head. That's an epiphany. It makes sense, right? It's the light bulb, and something turns on and shines light, and it makes something known. So, in my youth, this was never associated with a day in the life of the church. We certainly talked about the kings and the three gifts, but it was mostly focused on the baby Jesus and conjectures about what these gifts might mean about him and about his life. But these are musings beyond the text. The reality is that, in just a simple read of the text and the passage, the Holy Family has zero action. They're like statues over in our creche, frozen. So the focus, in some ways, really isn't even on them. It's not so much about the baby, and Joseph isn't even mentioned, but it's really about setting the larger stage for what this meant. And this is Matthew's gospel, or the author of Matthew. And so what sort of stage is this author setting? Well, a little bit of background here. I'll try not to geek out too much on it, but a little bit is that Matthew was written approximately around 80 CE. It was the second gospel. Mark was the first. And it is written not long after the destruction of the second temple. And what this means is that the Israelites, again, have really, really been traumatized. Again, they've had to be scattered throughout all of the land. They're really not in sort of one place. Their one central place of worship has again been destroyed. It's a rough time to be alive. The Roman Empire is pretty brutal. So that is the scene in which the author of Matthew is writing. And the people that are reading this and hearing this live in that time, and that's a really important thing. Another thing we see in Matthew is we see all these sort of insertions of various prophecies from the Old Testament. It's like if Matthew had cut and paste, the author had cut and paste a whole bunch of stuff from Jeremiah, from Isaiah, from Numbers, and sort of inserted it into this gospel that he was writing and saying, this is a fulfillment of Jewish prophecy. The other thing that the writer did is put in the story of the Magi finding the baby, which was shortly therefore followed by Herod. And what you guys heard about last week, the really difficult story that we don't like to talk about of Herod killing all the babies under 2. But again, for the people reading this at that time, because this was long after Jesus was alive, they were reading this and they were going, oh, we get it. We get it. Ancient prophecy, virgin birth narrative, an astrological event, and the slaughtering of the innocents, just like Pharaoh, just like Moses. So essentially, it's this repeat, and the readers would go, we get it. We have to pay attention to this baby. This is an important baby, because Moses was the central figure of the Jewish folks. Author of Matthew is making a case for Jesus. With the Magi coming from the east, we know that they're not Jewish. From the start here, we know that they are actually Gentiles. And so from the beginning, we have a clear signal that Jesus came to expand the notion of who was in and who was out. And we have a picture of the ones who aren't supposed to be chosen as actually being the wise ones. And this goes on throughout Matthew's gospel. So who were these guys, these Magi? Well, as I said, they were from the east, they were Gentiles, and they were from a priestly line, so they were considered kings of some variety, but their main identity was that they were astrologers. They were people that read the stars. At some point, the church tried to sort of really emphasize the king part and leave out the astrologer part, because that seemed a little woo-woo. But the reality is, these folks were astrologers, and at this time, this was a really important, respected profession. They had an important job. I mean, think about it. Magic, magi, they're obviously related, the two words. And what these guys did is that they shone light on what was in the most simple way. And the wisdom that these magi had was that they could see what others could not. Literally, they picked out of a haystack the needle that could begin to mend the brokenness of their own lives and the brokenness of the world. That needle being this baby. The Irish author James Joyce used the term epiphany to describe the moment when the soul of the commonest object seems to us radiant. That's the moment that that object achieves its epiphany. I kind of think this is the idea that we see here in Matthew. I mean, talk about a common object, a baby in a stable, in a manger, a really common object, pretty unnoteworthy. But these guys could see the radiance of this moment for what it was. So the question, obviously, to me, as I've sat with this text, is how do we become epiphany people? How do we see the extraordinary in the ordinary, and especially in that which is really easy to overlook? So I would guess that most of us can think of times in our lives when the curtains of our hearts and minds have opened, and we've had an epiphany in the truest sense of the word. We can't plan these things. They happen like the light bulb. They just happen. But maybe it was the moment that you knew it was time. You had to leave the job. You had to leave the relationship. You had to leave whatever situation it was. It became clear in that moment. Or maybe it was the moment you had to move towards something, towards a new thing, towards a new chapter, towards a risk. But you knew it in that moment. Maybe the epiphany is the creative idea that came to you at 3 a.m. The final line of the play, the middle stanza of the poem, the stroke of the brush that captured the essence of the painting. I think you probably know what I'm talking about, is my guess. I bet that if you think of epiphanies you've had in your life, that at least one of them has a kind of, how did I not see that before, quality about it. Do you know what I mean? Once our eyes see what has been there all along, we can feel so silly for having missed it all of this time. And once we see it, we can't act like we don't see it. Once we know it, we can't unknow it. We know it, we see it. I believe two things are true in this regard, in this business of seeing, really seeing. And one is that the truth, the insight, the direction is always there waiting to be seen. And the second is that we can only see it when something inside of us is ready to see it. I would say that something is the Holy Spirit. Some folks might say that something is the higher self or the psyche. But the thing, the power inside of us that knows, okay, now you're ready for this information. You can see this. And the Magi were ready to see it, and once they did, everything changed. Because they couldn't unsee it. They couldn't not know it once they had seen it and know it. So part of being Epiphany people is asking the question, are we ready for everything to change? It's a big question. The Gospel of Matthew is a bit of a reimagining of what the world could be. Coming after Mark, it's much more hopeful than Mark. Mark is kind of a pretty difficult gospel. There's not a huge amount of hope in it. But in Matthew, we have a lot of the same information with a lot more sort of reimagining of what the community could be. That's one of the messages of this gospel is we can create a new realm here on earth, and what would that be? So what if we were to reimagine what we might be? Sometimes in the midst of destruction, loss, certainly the kind that these folks were living in, sometimes in the midst of whatever it is that clears the slate, there is an opportunity to see what was actually there all along. And this was one of the messages of Matthew is this baby is really important. This baby is the one that we have been waiting for. But not all see it, and not all see him for who he is. So what if those of us who actually did see this unexpected happening and saw it for what it is, what if we did two things? Take a deep breath, and then secondly, roll up our sleeves and get ready to live into our own reimagining of what this means for our community. For example, if you were writing a gospel today, and a gospel is only simply means good news, that's all that it means. If you were writing good news for today, what would it be? Who would we say we were waiting for? Who would we say was the one to change things? Well, I happen to think that perhaps we could insert ourselves there and say we are the ones that we are waiting for. You are the one we are waiting for, and that applies to every person in here. And maybe this is our epiphany, that what has been in front of us all along, just that now in this moment of change, this moment of waiting to see what will fill this space, we see ourselves. There's a mirror there, and it has your own reflection in it. So think about this as we launch into this new year. Not only what are our hopes for the new year, but what are your hopes for this community? This community here at Union Kong, it's a big year. And then what are your hopes for this community in which we live, this larger community here, our neighbors beyond these walls? And what is your role in making that happen? Because there are unseen things and gifts and callings within you that are just waiting to be found when the time is right. And I happen to believe that that time might just be right now. And that you are the ones, that we are the ones that we are waiting for. You see, the Magi gave gifts fit for a king, really expensive, lavish gifts for royalty, for a king. But friends, they are nothing compared to the riches in you and every single one of you. So perhaps now is the time to realize the radiance of the most common things inside yourself and to offer them to the service of the Spirit as the reimagining work of God in this world continues. May we be Epiphany people, because only you can give your gift.